Now, Luke's background, the question about Luke was a doctor, and we've got some interesting things in terms of showing Luke as a doctor. There's this guy named Hildebrandt in the 1900s tried to prove that he was a doctor from his vocabulary. And so he notes things like this, that back in the ancient world, they had basically two ways to refer to fevers. There was a low fever and a high fever. And it's very interesting. In Luke chapter 4, verse 38, it says Peter's mother-in-law had a high fever. And so a high fever, that's a doctor's description. That's how a doctor would describe it, in those times. Luke chapter 5, verse 12, the men were full of leprosy. It just doesn't say they were lepers and things like that and let it go, but he describes the leprosy. And a doctor, they describe diseases, okay? And so a man was full of leprosy. And so Hobart and others have tried to suggest that the way Luke describes diseased persons is the way that a medical person would describe it. And there's possibly some truth there. Wouldn't push it, though. He says the vocabulary, Luke uses a very developed vocabulary. He's got like 800 what they call hapax legomena, which means they only occur once. The words are only used once in the New Testament, which means his vocabulary is very developed. If you've ever seen doctors have very developed vocabulary, especially with Latin words, knowing what medicines need to be given. Although my daughter now shows me that she's got a handheld device now that you can just punch in and it comes up with the names of these long words of these medicines they have now. You can just click on it and now sends it to CVS. And so you don't have to memorize all these names anymore or get them mixed up and that type of thing. But anyways, Luke seems to have that, but it's been interesting. They studied Josephus, who also had an extensive vocabulary and who also uses many medical terms in describing things. But Josephus was a historian. So just because a person has a developed vocabulary and uses certain medical terms doesn't mean they're a doctor. And so Josephus was a historian. He was not a doctor. Luke, though, seems to be a doctor, but you can't prove it on the basis of this thing. And this is the medical language argument. I wouldn't put too much stock in that, okay? Many people can use medical terms to refer to things, and so don't weigh that argument too heavily. Josephus, as we mentioned, Josephus was a historian, a Jewish historian, 40 AD to 100 AD, some as are just ballpark figures, but largely after Jesus, but kind of in the era when John and the disciples are writing the New Testament. Josephus is a Jewish historian, writes the Antiquities of the Jews, other documents that are really, really interesting from that period. Here's a big one for me. In Colossians chapter 4, verse 14, Paul labels him and basically calls him Luke, the beloved physician. And Luke, the beloved physician. I don't know much about doctors in the ancient world, but I have seen doctors' instruments that were used early in America. And all I'm saying is doctors today, very, very different instruments, very different procedures and things than doctors back then. And so, I don't know what the doctor training was back then, but I would certainly not want to be operated by doctors back then. But you can see Paul, who was getting beat up all the time, and Paul was stoned to the point of being dead. You'd think having a doctor along would be very, very helpful. It's kind of like if you're going to start a company, you kind of need an accountant, If you're going to be a missionary and you're going to get beat up all the time, it's nice to have a doctor that travels with you. And so Luke is called the beloved physician here by Paul in Colossians chapter 4, verse 14. It's also interesting, he seems to be a Gentile, of Gentile descent. He seems not to be Jewish, and this is there's various things that indicate this. We just want to look at some of them briefly, that Luke seems to be Jewish. Jesus never speaks Aramaic in the book of Luke. Okay, Jesus does not speak Aramaic. Some of the things that we're used to saying, Jesus would say, Talitha kum, little girl, get up. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Those types of things that Jesus said, Aramaic, are not found in the mouth of Jesus here. So if he's a Roman citizen from Troas, he's kind of a Greek-Roman kind of background. Probably not Jewish, so he doesn't speak Aramaic and picks up things like that. Although he was in Israel for 2 years. And a guy who's smart like that, you give 2 years a person in a foreign country like that, my guess is he's going to pick up some Aramaic. Even I picked up some Arabic when we went to church for a year in Bethlehem, outside of Bethlehem. And so you pick things up. He was there for 2 years, so it's possible he could have. Hebrew names are avoided also in the book. There's no Satan, Satan reference there. Gethsemane, I mentioned. Hosannas. Do you remember Jesus rides a donkey into Jerusalem and they all say, Hosanna, Hosanna? Well, that's, those are Aramaic kind of phraseologies and stuff, and that's not found in the book of Luke. So again, these are just little indicators, don't prove that much, but just little indicators that he's not a native Jewish kind of thing. He is grouped with the Gentiles. When Paul lists his buddies in Colossians chapter 4, verses 10 and following, Luke is grouped with the Gentiles, not the Jews. So he seems to be in a Gentile grouping there. Again, that's not strong. This is one of the strongest arguments for me. In Acts chapter 1, verse 19, Judas goes out and hangs himself and throws the money back to the chief priests and stuff. The chief priests are going to buy a field. They buy a field called a kaldama. And it says a kaldama, which means field of blood in their language. Now when Luke says in the book of Acts, in their language, that means he doesn't speak the language. It's their language, not his language. His language is probably going to be Greek and Latin and not Aramaic and stuff. So in their language, referring to that. So he's going to be a Gentile. He's not really from Israel and that kind of stuff. He explains locations too. So in chapter 1, verse 26, if you're Jewish, it'd be like saying you're an American. And if somebody says, L.A., you know where L.A. is. You know where Las Vegas is. You know where Dallas is. You know where Miami is. You know where New York is, Boston, Niagara Falls. You know major places in America, Minneapolis, Chicago. Those types of things. Those are just common. Everybody in America knows where Chicago is or whatever. Here, if you're from another country, you may not know cities and places. You may know one or two, and then you just focus on those one or two places. But it's interesting here in chapter 1, verse 26 in the book of Acts, it says, in the 6th month, this is in Luke 1:26. In the 6th month, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee. Now, he adds this, a town in Galilee. Every Jew would know Nazareth is in Galilee. So if he were writing to Jews, and he himself were a Jew, he wouldn't put in the explanatory in a town in Galilee. So he explains locations. If you're a native, you wouldn't do that. Old Testament quotes. The book of Matthew, 40 quotes and plus all sorts of inferences in the book of Matthew. Old Testament. It has been written. You have heard that it was said in old times. Luke does away with all that. Now, very few quotes from the Old Testament, and mostly when the quotes in the Old Testament come up, they're from the mouth of Jesus. Chapter 4, verse 4, chapter 4, verse 8, chapter 4, verse 12. Mostly from the mouth of Jesus is when you get the Old Testament quotes. So we've got Luke as a Gentile. Luke is not from Israel. He's probably from basically up here, northwestern Turkey, up by Troas, up by, you know where Troy is? You guys have heard Troy from the Iliad and the Odyssey. Troas up in that region, northwestern Turkey.